Hello, every folks, and good morning. Welcome to another one of these sort of like character breakdown type of videos here. Now, as with the first one, I will point out this is largely just going to be kind of my reading of events based off of kind of personal experience and whatever else, stuff that I potentially found relatable or whatnot. Will definitely make a difference when it comes to what's believable or not, and additionally, rather than covering just one character, we're kind of covering two here today. By the way, it's total coincidence that this happens to be the second Priest video in a row. This isn't going to be like the Priest series, unless it is, in which case, this is where it started. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get started on this whole thing, shall we? Obviously, spoilers, by the way. If you somehow manage to get this far and you don't know what goes on in Night of Lodis, just go play it. It's a fantastic game. Personally, like, as far as nostalgia factor goes, it's definitely my absolute top of the pile as far as Tactics Ogre goes. It may not be the most mechanically deep, it may not have the best designed battles, but man, oh man, the nostalgia is real for this one. I mean, if there's one game that basically just comes pre-equipped with 20 pairs of rose-tinted goggles for me personally, it's Night of Lodis. Anyway, let's go ahead and get going on this thing, shall we? So, this video actually originally started from watching Warren Report's video on what Alfons was up to during this whole game here, and how it related to what Tardy was up to through the whole series. With that said, he really didn't care for the relationship between these two, saying that it wasn't believable. Now, personally, I found it weirdly relatable as far as the relationship between these two, but it's going to take a little bit of explaining as to why. So to that end, we're going to start at the very beginning and just cover a lot of weird nuances along the way, because there is nothing traditional about the way that these two end up winding up together. Honestly, I would describe it more as a trauma bonding experience than anything else. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, we got to start off with Alfons, because that's where our story begins. So what's his deal? Why is he so angsty? Well, he's very similar at least as far as I read it, to Magnus from Ogre Battle 64, in that he's basically got a chip on his shoulder and something to prove when he ends up coming out to Ovis. That he wants to go and sort of prove himself as his own person. He's more or less got an issue with his new family. Now, he mentions this in the intro, but it rarely ever comes up. So essentially, from what I understand, his old father ended up dying, his mother ends up marrying somebody new, and he frickin' hates that guy. And he ends up getting his new name there, but he wants to just kind of create his own self. He wants to create his own place, he wants to have his own accomplishments, he doesn't want to be in the shadow of somebody else. So anyways, he comes out with his friend Richter in order to go make a name for himself, as people, do on military campaigns and such. So he finds his way out here. He essentially plays the part of the dedicated soldier until he ends up getting himself shot off a cliff, at which point Eleanor finds him laying there on the beach. Hey, guess what? Free boyfriend. Anyway, so she somehow ends up dragging him and his armor up to the church, and/or just like awkwardly strips everything off and drags a naked guy to the church. I don't know. It always seemed a little bit funny to me, because she seems fairly kind of small by comparison whenever you look at the art there, but hey, you know what? It is what it is. It's an uphill climb. Maybe she's super into CrossFit. Maybe she has leg day regularly. Who knows? Anyway, as far as Eleanor is concerned, somehow she gets him to the church. Now, arguably, there might have been other handlers at the church who might have helped. Maybe Father Hammond helped. I doubt he did, because he seems like a bit of an ass, but either way, somehow she gets this dude to the church. Actually, come to think of it, I wonder if Ivana helped, because she was kind of just sort of there. Maybe she was hanging out at the church. You know what? We're going to say that Ivana and Eleanor presumably carried him up to the church. Alright, anyway. So at that point, she starts telling him about cool shit she saw on the island, including a mermaid with golden scales, to just kind of more or less pass the time. And eventually, Alphonse's relationship ADD kicks in. He realizes that there's an Ivana to go follow there, and he just ends up following her straight out the door. Now, the reason that I mention that particular aspect of the whole thing is because it's part of the sort of awkwardness that can potentially play out with a lot of the relationships that he has in this game. Because every time that Alphonse ends up meeting somebody, he's almost like a lost puppy, just instantly deciding which side to go with, and then just blindly following them from there on forward. However, in the most ideal scenario between the relationship between him and Eleanor, she ends up being the one that he ends up following a good bit of the time. So she ends up giving him a little bit of advice at the very start, but not very much. However, in the B route, if you follow that whole thing through, he very quickly ends up going back. He meets up with her at the church again to get her take on the whole mermaid situation. Once he goes and visits the mermaids, despite the fact that they were having a little bit of an awkward sudden date out of nowhere, he mostly was just there for advice, and she was just looking for somebody to talk to. It is awkward, it is weird, for sure. Like, it's kind of weird that they're going back and forth there, but as far as I can tell, it sort of seems to be a case where he wants somebody that he can rely on that isn't related to success in the world, so to speak. So, like, Ivana's got her ambitions to go get her family stuff sorted. Richter's got his ambitions to get his mission figured out. He's got Sybil over there trying to do all that spy shit. And then he's just seeing Eleanor here as like, hey, you're like the one person I met here that doesn't work for me, that also does not have some gigantic ambition in mind. I need your take as the sort of neutral party here. At least that's the way that I read it. So, anyways, at that point he goes off, he meets with the mermaids, he remembers about hearing about Brevra earlier after talking with the mermaid leader, comes back to talk with Eleanor again, and she gets upset that she's being used for information at that point, as, would probably come up at that point. Now, one thing I will point out as far as her random outbursts and/or random seeming situations where, like, she seems very worried a lot of the time, like she seems very clingy and worried and stuff like that. Bear in mind, she is living with essentially an abusive father herself. Like, as far as like trauma bonding and stuff like that goes, we already know that Father Hammond beats her. We already know that she's scared of him. The very first scene, it seems like, she's just very doting and off to go help him out. Later on, we see that he actually actively goes after her, and Richter does nothing. We see that he's the one who basically ratted her out as far as information went to Richter's soldiers and stuff. He's the one that demands that Richter bring her back as basically like a pet. So, as far as all that goes, we can assume that there was probably worse abuse going on there if that's the stuff that we see in the open, right? We also know from her backstory later and her necklace that effectively she was already abandoned at birth. When she was originally raised in her original hometown, she was regularly bullied because of being supposedly raised by a mermaid there, at which point her necklace goes full nuclear and basically kills a bunch of the people there, and she ends up running away to go live in the middle of nowhere. So she hasn't exactly had a happy upbringing. She doesn't really have much of a support network to rely on, so when it comes to her getting very clingy with somebody that not only has the means to change the world around them by means of an army, but also seems to value her advice, that's pretty understandable. So essentially, she sees a way out of her situation. She sees a way to sort of feel safer in her general environment, and he sees somebody that he can rely on to remain neutral. At least, again, as far as how I read it. So it seems like the two of them realize that they have roles for each other, but they don't necessarily, they don't exactly have much in the way of chemistry. They need each other in a very utilitarian sort of sense, right? And I will say, a lot of this ended up hitting very personally for me growing up, because there were kind of echoes of a lot of that stuff that I found very relatable, because there was a good number of years that I was basically traveling along, as I mentioned, like last time, alcoholic parents and all that for the most part, and anytime that there was any situation where there was any people that seemed completely impartial to everything, they always held a lot more value in my eyes personally, as it's just here's this new kind of talking situation that is very safe. You can openly talk about being upset about things in your situation. You can't even directly go and talk with let's say there was a Catholic school growing up, and there was this whole thing of you can't even directly talk about anything that you're upset about with your parents, because that's disrespecting your parents and stuff like that. So anytime that there was a sort of sense of neutrality out there, it became very relatable, Again, I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but I'm hoping you get the general idea. When you're in that situation where it feels like there's no options, even an inadequate option, as far as whether this is somebody you would normally get along with in a neutral sense, suddenly holds a lot more value. Now, anyways, let's go ahead and move on to the point where they both get knocked off a cliff. So, when she ends up getting upset, she walks outside. Richter's soldiers are waiting for them. And that's when we see that that moment that she basically ends up finally choosing to go with Alphons there, because she was perfectly happy to stay where she was and just kind of valuing the conversation up to that point. As soon as she became an asset to multiple parties and stuff like that, she ends up siding with the one that isn't trying to send dragons to eat her, obviously. So they get to a cliff. She decides to stick with Alphons at that point, and essentially Richter ends up trying to have them arrested, but instead, because he completely misunderstands how steadfast works, he has his soldiers knock them off a cliff. Okay, it's more like they corner them, and then she decides that, even though Alphons isn't much of a swimmer, it's time for them to go and jump. Actually, wait a minute, no, she doesn't. I think he's the one that decides it. She starts thinking it, he ends up agreeing with it, or something along those lines. I forget exactly who does which part of that. Long story short, they just hold hands, all adorable-like, and jump into the ocean. And again, I do mention that Richter specifically misunderstands how steadfast works, because immediately after this moment, we see his soldiers upgraded to knights, so I guess he's assuming that he's playing a completely different game, and you know what, that's how you prevent people from falling off cliffs. It's fine, he tried, we already know he's not very good at playing this thing. Anyway, at that point, they go and they meet with Barevra, and she goes and tells them the whole story about how she ended up going and kind of getting busy with one of the enemy human soldiers during their whole war. She gave away their super weapon, and it kind of resulted in her people getting genocided, and then he died, and just ultimately that didn't end up going particularly well as far as plans went. But as far as the two survivors, though, they end up getting themselves out of that cave, and they find themselves with a sort of new lease on life. They go back to their one captured fortress up to that point, and start making plans to go kind of quell the rest of the island. That they have their sort of small army put together, but they end up rallying together at Firmido and talk about taking Astoria Castle. Now, it's at this point that there's a little... Actually, hold on, just one second. Winter is gonna winter, what can I say? Man, I'm so tired of leaky noses, I need all this damn snow to go away, which is fitting because now is where all the snow shows up in our part of the story here. Now, let's go ahead and discuss this, because this is kind of where things branch off a little bit as far as their relationship is concerned. Now, between the A route and B route, one of the main differences between the two is that Alphons can end up going back and essentially visiting her an extra time in the B route because of the way that he's trying to essentially use an underground pass to get to where the mermaids are, rather than trying to capture one of them directly. Now, as far as that goes, I feel like that's one of those moments that just sort of solidifies him as a more neutral party. If you go the other way, though, essentially he is directly just only showing up to go talk to her again when he needs information. So it's kind of understandable why there would be a little bit of a split there, because, again, he has not shown any interest in going back until he randomly was like, hey, you remember that one time that you fished me out of the ocean? Well, speaking of fish, I need to talk about fish people with you. You see, we're kind of looking for this thing over here. Oh, you want out of your situation? Yeah, that's nice. Anyway, fish though, like he does come off as a little bit jerky in that particular situation. Now, I have a feeling due to budget and whatever else, they probably didn't want to create alternate versions of that scene, because she does react the same way in both situations. The way that I personally read that is, well, I mean, obviously the budget thing, but also. She probably was just interrogated by Richter's people, considering that they're just kind of waiting outside, so there's that as well. Anyway, so as far as their relationship goes, when she ends up going and asking to come along at this point, this is also when I like to think that the A route version is just like, no, it's too dangerous, you're just a random civilian, who cares? And then the B route version prefers to keep her around, because again, they just sort of see each other as a sort of safety net of sorts. Just somebody neutral to go and talk to, and it's fitting because, as you see by her alignment, she is completely neutral. She is not lawful, as you would kind of expect from somebody on the religious side of things, nor is she chaotic like a lot of the sort of spies and such throughout the game. So it does kind of tell you that they're firmly in that sort of just kind of worrying about themselves sort of bubble there, right? Now, from there on out, though, that's when we have the attack on Astoria Castle, and she just kind of is just sort of there for most of that. But the main other route split that we see with Eleanor is whether or not she ends up arriving at the Heaven's Gate. So when you go and you attack Shaher, when you go and attack his place, if she's brought along for those fights, she'll essentially have been just sort of assumed to have been at your side that whole time, whereas if she was left behind, it's assumed that she wasn't. Now, that can play out a bunch of different ways. Dang it, my dang nose, hold on. Alright, back and still dreading all the dang snow. Though, frankly, again, still fitting for this game, especially if you happen to have recruited any mermaids up to this point. Like, seriously, I don't know what they had against mermaids, but, like, just freezing over the entire map in most situations is just such a troll, but we'll cover that later. So I want to make sure that I don't miss any details here when it comes to the endings, because they do have some interesting subtext behind them. And so we're just going to go over, I pulled up all of the sort of text descriptions of all the endings, and we're going to cover just kind of how this affects their relationships there, just for context. So first is going to be the D ending. Well, actually, technically first would be the game over ending, but there's not really too much that happens there. You lose, the island ends up getting consumed, no one ever manages to get the place to be fixed. Yeah, that's just kind of about it. So, the place just becomes a weird dark hole that nobody can go into, so I don't think we're going to have too many relationship questions in that situation. So then we have the D ending. So this is going to, let's go ahead and double check the parameters just to be certain here. So D ending is that Eleanor has died before you beat the final boss. So Shaher and Alfons talk, and Shaher tells Alfons to go with him. Then they both die. Richter's father dispatches troops to Ovis to find Richter, but they never do. A violent earthquake occurs on Ovis near the mountains. In the year 232, turmoil arises between landlords on Ovis. A year later, Ovis becomes governed by Lodis. Brevra appears to Clori and tells her to leave the young alone. A mermaid stands on the cliff in Arena and watches birds go by. A girl walks out of the church in Celia to meet some other children. A boy comments about it snowing at the church. So yeah, that's kind of when all of the snow starts rolling in. That's when you would start to kind of getting some vibes of what would later happen in Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. But either way, they're referencing that it's there, but Alphonse was never there to make it happen. So from there, we get to the D end, or not the D ending, but the C ending. So this is from either choice in Cape Uradella, but Eleanor doesn't actually come to your party when you end up fighting the final boss. So in this one, Shaher tells Alphonse to go with him, and then they both just kind of die. Eleanor is at Angel's headstone and calls Alphonse a liar for not coming back to her. The castle begins to crumble. Eleanor is in bed in Celia. A priest in training talks to her about it snowing at the beach and how God must be playing today. She says that she wanted to be with Alphonse. Clori and Brevra goes with her, leaving the young to fend on their own. A mermaid is in Arena on a cliff and sees birds go by. A girl walks out of the church and goes next to Eleanor on the beach. They tell Eleanor that it's snowing and the children run off. And Eleanor says, "Listen, Alphonse, it snowed that day." So I don't know if she's talking to Alphonse or if she, later named a kid Alphonse, but either way, so that's about that. So essentially she is permanently missing the guy. So we already know that when it comes to who really cared here one way or the other, the question is whether Alphonse ends up caring. She basically does no matter what. Like, she really genuinely cared about the dude. So let's go ahead and move on next to the B route ending. Now this one is essentially going to be, as far as I'm concerned, the best ending in the game. But this is going to happen when you choose B and Cape Uradella and include Eleanor in your final party when you fight the boss. Additionally, even though it's not counted for the ending, one of the options later, so you've got a choice of A or B later when you go back to visit her at the church. There actually is another choice there in which openly Alphonse will just basically will say that he wants to be with her, which for those unfamiliar with old-timey game parlance is basically, hey, you want to do it, more or less. It's one of those weird translation quirks where when somebody says they want to be with somebody, they mean with them, not they just want to hang out. So to address the old concern from probably 10 years ago that people had of hey, is it dating or is it not dating? Which level of dating are we at? I kid you not, my wife and I had that conversation. She's like, wait, but are we dating? Yeah, we're actually dating. But which kind of dating? The dating kind. The dating, want to be with you kind. Oh, the good kind of dating. Yes. Anyway, sorry, just I don't know if there's any other people that look back on that kind of stuff and think like, how could we possibly have this confusion? Anyway, the other option there was just you've done your best, which is honestly the most like head pat patronizing shit. But that one gives you an orb, the other one gives you a circlet of wisdom, which is like the orb is going to be basically a nuke. The circlet of wisdom, though, if you give it to Eleanor, she becomes your nuke. So honestly, just way better. Anyway, so as far as the B ending is concerned, though, that choice isn't technically relevant, but I always kind of personally kept it as one of those options that should have been. So B route, Sybil and Shaher go and die together, which, by the way, if you were ever curious, even if you backstab Sybil at every opportunity, kill her at every opportunity instead of just wounding her and stuff like that, despite the fact that she will die like 2 separate times over the course of the story, she still will show up here. So how she keeps coming back, I don't know. She's basically Ada Wong anyway. I guess it works. Anyway, so Sybil and Shaher go and die together after Sybil tells Shaher that God can't love him. Alfons sends the spear to Gallius and they start to leave the island alone. So basically he gives them relics and they piss off. So the Lodis Empire, that's one of those interesting little bits of context that I have a feeling is one of the reasons that Matsuno might have maybe not been too happy with this game, because they are shown in the offshoot games to be a bit more reasonable about the stuff that they do. So like in the case of what happens here, like he sends them relics and then they just don't try to invade again. Like, as long as stuff is fine and they're sending tribute, they don't care. Anyway, so Alfons sends the spear to Gallius, and they leave the island alone. Eleanor and Alfons leave Ovis together, and no one from Ovis ever hears from them again. This is when we get the infamous, they're off to go do it in the woods scene. Then the mermaid's queen is in the mermaid throne room, and the spirit of Barevra comes to see her. Barevra tells her to come with her, and they leave the world to the young. The mermaid queen turns into a spirit, and the two float off. So basically, it's the only one where we see kind of what happens inside the mermaid sanctuary there. Euphry is praying at her mother's grave. Elric walks up and she says, Father, and he says nothing. This does not happen if you turned Elric into a sword, by the way. You should do that. He's kind of a piece of shit. Anyway, Richter and Ivana decide to get married and become the king and queen of Ovis. Now, do you see why I'm saying this is the best ending in the series? You get the two that finally get their, like, you actually see a sort of romance subplot actually play out for once in the series. Not only once, but twice. There is basically no chemistry between Richter and Ivana, but the two of them happen to both be kind of royalty that are both single and both kind of looking to create stability on the island, so that ends up working out perfectly. So you have a case where everybody gets exactly what they wanted. You get Lodis getting the fancy spear that they wanted. You get Richter that wanted to just sort of be his own person, just like Alfons wanted to be. Alfons just wanted to be accepted in his own place, his own family, and whatever else. He felt alien at home. So rather than going and staging a coup to go reframe that home as a place that he would like, instead he ends up just, getting hitched. It ends up working out perfectly. Ivana gets her family stuff sorted. The mermaids end up trusting their own people enough to actually let them run the world and stuff like that. It's good. Honestly, people retiring from politics once they're too old should happen more often. What a thought, except maybe not too young. Okay, we're getting too political. Let's go ahead and move on. From there, we get into the worst endings. So then we've got the A ending. This is going to be the longest ending in the game, and A+ is the canonical version. A is kind of like the main version of this. So in order to get A, you would have needed to... Here, let's go pull this up again. So to get A, it's just choice A in Cape Uridella and include Eleanor when you fight the final boss. So to get once you get this one, so after Shaher dies, Eleanor runs up to him and tells him how God loves him and how he loves God, and she goes away with him in a big flash of light. So basically, she chooses religion over herself, more or less. Bad choice. Anyway, moving on. Alfons wakes up at Eleanor's house in the bed. He goes to the beach, missing her. A knight or man runs up, tells him that Lodis is coming to arrest him very soon for Richter's death. Then he's on a boat. Shivan is on the docks. Sybil and Alfons are in cloaks. They're going away to the mainland for safety. They get on the boat, and Alfons looks back at Ovis one last time. Goodbye, Eleanor, is all he says. We see seagulls flying over the ship as it floats away. Side note, what is it with Game Boy games and seagulls representing lost girlfriends? I'm assuming there's more context behind that. I haven't looked into it. Anyway, So we see the Mermaid Queen. She's sitting there, and the Spirit of Forever comes up, and the two float off. Credits roll. We see Sybil and Shivan on a cliff talking. Sybil says she's not going back to Gallius. Sybil tells Shivan that he's free to go. If he goes with her, he'll be pursued. Shivan swears to follow her anywhere. Sybil removes a necklace or something and throws it on the ground. I forget what that's all about. Anyway, presumably she's quitting her faction or something. We see Ivana as queen in the palace, talking about how the Duke of Felis didn't send troops to the island again. Lodis got ticked at him for not talking, or not talking about the spirit of them, apparently. Let's see. We see Euphry and her mother at her mother's grave. Yeah, that's the same as before. We see Ariel at Rana looking over the former battlefield. Mermaid soldier runs up, tells her to return to the city where it's safe. Ariel snaps at her and says how she can trust some humans now, and she says how race doesn't matter. It's the inside that counts, and she says she'll confide in them. We'll see seagulls flying over the water. Man, oh man, if she can be wrong in a few years. We see Alfons bowing before the high priest. She calls him Alphonse Tartare. She? I thought it was... Do we ever actually see their face? I don't know. Anyway, so he's blessed and changes his name to Lens Tartare. Alphonse says he is honored. And then there's a narration. With Neris dead, Lodis neither punished or pursued the Betrals. The death was placed on Neris's greed. Ovis was put under Gallius' control. The Duke of Felis was placed under supervision of Lodis for hiding information on the Sacred Spear. This is the account of Ovis in 232, and the Sacred Spear and the young knight who suppressed it. He became known as Lance Tartare and didn't leave his mark in history until later. And then the A+ ending is basically what happens if you do all of the above, but instead you also have Alphonse get at least 50 kills himself, beat the game in under 25 hours, and you don't lose more than 10 people. So basically you speedrun the game while also getting the Berserk Emblem. And in that particular one, it's basically the exact same as the previous one. We just also see a... essentially the opening scene of Tactics Ogre Lucked. So it's essentially him going and burning down Goliath. Now, interesting thing about that, by the way, they actually have a Game Boy rendition of the same music that plays during that one, and additionally, the final scene, the final scene takes place here. Whereas in the B route, one of my favorite moments of that one was that you actually see the stained glass window sort of portraits that they've been using for everything. During the credits, as they're scrolling by, you see the picture of him with his eye patch and sword and stuff like that, and it's all burned away, so that part of history is just gone. So either way, so basically what we can sort of glean from this whole situation here is that when it comes to the relationship between these two, she basically cared for him initially out of necessity, but ultimately just saw him as, somebody safe to cling to from the very beginning. How Alphonse ends up reacting to the whole thing is sort of what ends up dictating their relationship, so it also depends entirely on how the player saw that particular situation. So the way that I saw it was, he had the one person that ended up helping him without any strings attached, ends up giving him a cool piece of headwear later. Actually, here, then. Might as well just go and give that to her right here. I don't know why I didn't have that on her, because I could have sworn I already did. Did I do that this time around, or no? Here, it should be under the headwear here. Did I ever even... Come to think... You know what, let's go check if that scene's actually over there. I wonder if I never actually went back on this particular save file. I don't know, maybe this is after the point where that cutscene triggers. I don't know. I have no freaking idea. I mean, it was... One way or another, I think... Maybe I did get it and I just sold it or something. I don't know. But yeah, you have a circlet of wisdom that would show up over here. Oh well, it is what it is. Also, apparently, I've got my controls somewhat set up weird on the emulator here. Oh well. So with that being said, let's go ahead and kind of continue on there. So as far as, again, the relationship there, the way that I see it is, again, just kind of trauma bonding. The way that the two of them can basically just sort of see each other as, again, a neutral, safe party, more or less. They end up seeing safety in each other, even if it's not the sort of traditional romantic interest kind of thing. It's more of a case of man, You know, this person just, it just feels safe around them, kind of a thing. Not a, oh my god, they're so freaking hot, and like, that sort of thing. It's just more of a, like, you know what, this person ain't judging me for any kind of situation over here. We can just sort of sit and chill. Like, they're that kind of relationship. So, given that everybody else around them is either abusive or after something, it does make sense in that particular way as far as the two of them feeling safe around each other. Additionally, one more thing that's kind of interesting to note here, one of the reasons that Eleanor ends up lashing out as often as she does, as well as assumes that she's going to be judged at every situation here, is the fact that she is this game's princess as well. So basically, she gets the ability of the traditional kind of princess class here. Now, this is kind of funny because, okay, this ability was just sort of built into the princess class in March of the Black Queen. It was implied to be part of the princess class with stuff like the Star Ion ability over in Tactics Ogre Lucked. And in this particular one, she just sort of gets it as an inbuilt ability, presumably because of the fact that she got mermaid powers. Those aren't really explained too much, because up to that point, it's sort of assumed that whatever the hell was going on that was causing her to randomly magically explode was to do with this necklace of hers, because that's where it was originating from, and instead, it's just a regular pearl necklace as far as we can tell. So presumably she just had that ability the whole time. I honestly have no idea what's up with that. But that being said, it is hilarious as to why anybody would intentionally go out of their way to not use her when she's potentially one of the most potent weapons in the game. Like, Star Tiara is an interesting ability in that she only gets it once per level, so there's a limited number of uses throughout the entire game, but she is somebody that essentially can be used to nuke the entire map, and then will just immediately forget that ability. She, just like it happens in the story, she just sort of forgets when and how that ability actually happened, and then she only remembers when she ends up gaining another level. So I'll just go ahead and kind of show it off here real quick while we add a few final notes. So I don't think they ever really I don't think they ever really get to the point of let's say that sort of like FF8 level of like absolute cheese on screen as far as the relationship between the two, because again, the two of them, they sort of just hang out next to each other because, well, they're looking for that neutral party. Like, they're looking specifically for that person that won't judge them, not specifically for this, like, big old passionate thing. Like, they're specifically caring about each other because of the fact that they feel safe around each other. Nothing more kind of carnal than that, so to speak. Both of them came from very sort of rigid backgrounds, her being, you know, raised effectively as a nun, and he was being raised as a soldier, so the two of them are not exactly very emotionally expressive as far as all this stuff is concerned. So yeah, their scenes are definitely on the more awkward side. They're definitely on the less chatty side. So just the fact that they're even willing to admit that they like each other to any degree is already a possibly more than they're used to expressing in the first place. So that's just kind of one thing that I want to point out there, because I did hear that brought up a couple of times as like a sign of like, well, they can't be a very convincing relationship there if they're not like crazy into each other in all of these, I guess you could say, salsa dancing kind of ways. But again, it's more of like a just trauma bonding experience as far as I'm concerned. So either way, I would like to get your guys' takes as far as what you think of this whole thing. Like, do you think that they're a believable thing? Like, what was your impression whenever you were going and playing this whole thing? And like, what was your take on this whole situation? Do you think that they should have been a bit more, I don't know, handsy with each other or whatever else, or is it, or is this an accurate portrayal of how stuff tends to work in repressive societies? Because I think it is. Either way, that is way too much deep diving into a sort of kind of subplot of a subplot of you know, a little relationship that happens in a game, you know, on a Game Boy from over a decade ago. So that's kind of about that. Anyways, y'all have yourselves a good one. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope this was at least interesting. All right, see you guys. Bye.